that what people want from this thing is tutorials. So welcome back, everybody, to another Open Game Data Open Office Hour. I'll kind of brush through my podcast intro thing here. So we're an NSF-funded research incubator focused on bringing a collective of researchers interested in the use of data generated in and around games to advance our scientific understanding of thinking, learning, and decision making. And our goal is to make kind of two things. One is to bring this community together, compile sort of a set of best practices and a community of practice, and to eventually build some actual hard research infrastructure. Got a bunch of resources already. We've got the Open Game Data website, hosted a field day. We have a Slack where we connect with each other. And then we have these open office hour sessions and their recordings.